Did Russia really achieve its goals in Syria? And is Vladimir Putin ready to compromise on Ukraine? The Russian president says yes to both during a marathon meeting with the press, but doesn't go into detail. Meanwhile, Putin says he is ready for talks with U.S. President-elect Trump while challenging the U.S. to a missile duel of the 21st century. So is Putin speaking from a position of strength or bluffing his way forward on the global stage? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Russia. Well, if you listen to Vladimir Putin address the press on Thursday, you could easily believe Russia is in great shape. According to Putin, the relationship with China has reached a level never seen before. And in spite of the fact that its war in Ukraine is now well into its third year and its ally in Syria has been overthrown, President Putin insists Russian strategy is working. But is it? Here's a look now at how Putin sees Russia's place in the world and why he shouldn't be written off.
In his first public words since the fall of his ally, Syria's Bashar al-Assad, President Putin insisted that Russia's involvement in Syria remains steadfast, even as new challenges emerge. President Putin's comments come after rebel forces ousted Assad's government, a dramatic turn in Syria's fate. But Putin dismissed the notion that Russia has suffered a defeat.
You would like to present everything that is happening in Syria as some kind of failure, a defeat for Russia. I assure you, it is not. We have achieved our goals.
That's not a view shared by many in the international community. Russia intervened in Syria in 2015, turning the tide of the civil war in Assad's favor. Moscow's mission now is clear, says Putin, to prevent the creation of a terrorist stronghold in Syria and to secure strategic military footholds in the region.
We maintain relations with all the groups that control the situation there, with all the countries in the region. The overwhelming majority of them tell us they will be interested in us keeping our military bases in Syria.
Putin emphasized that Russia's relationship with Syria's interim leaders remains strong despite the change. He also revealed plans to meet with Assad in Moscow soon, adding they'd not met since Assad's forced departure from Syria. While Putin's waning influence in Syria is clear, the war in Ukraine continues to dominate Russia's foreign policy. Putin used his press conference to express openness to talks with US President-elect Donald Trump, even as tensions with the West remain high. He also expressed a willingness to compromise on Ukraine, a sign perhaps of a growing desire to end the war. But his boldest statement came when discussing Russia's new hypersonic missile, the Oreshnik. He claimed that this missile could pierce any Western air defense system, challenging the West to test it in real time.
We are ready for such an experiment. Let them concentrate all their air and missile defense forces in Kiev. We will hit it with Oreshnik and see what happens. We are ready for such an experiment. Is the other side ready?
Putin's comments on the Oreshnik missile underscore Russia's growing military ambitions and its willingness to challenge the Western powers head-on. From Ukraine to Syria to swathes of Africa, President Putin's ambitions show little sign of diminishing.
So how should one interpret Vladimir Putin's interpretation of the events of the last year? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Moscow, former spokesperson to President Putin, Sergei Markov; from Geneva, Senior Advocacy Advisor at the Syrian Forum, Danny Al-Baaj; and from Washington, Professor at the National Defense University, David DeRoche. Thanks all so much for being with me. Sergei, I'll begin by letting you explain what some characterize as kind of one of the more confusing statements that your president made, saying Russia has achieved all its goals in Syria in spite of Assad being overthrown. So how so?
Yeah, it's confusing only for those who too much trust to the Western propaganda. Don't trust them. And Russia don't fight for Bashar Assad. Bashar Assad last few years didn't follow Russian advice. You can look, for example, on the Russian flags on portrait of Vladimir Putin. Syrian streets have been full of them a few years ago, but not the last few years. Russian goal was not to serve for Bashar Assad. Then Russia was giving recommendation to Bashar Assad to make more liberalization, to create new constitution with federalism, to political police not to be so cruel with opponents. Bashar Assad didn't follow this Russian advice. That's why he politically collapsed. It was not military collapse. It was political collapse of Bashar Assad. It's because he didn't follow Russian advice. So Russia now not happy about what's happening, but it's not Russian defeat. Only Western propaganda talking about Russian defeat in Syria. It's Iranian defeat, that's right, but not Russian defeat. Russia will be able to build a relationship with new government.
Fair enough. Danny, does that make sense? And also, if you could answer, how does Putin actually interpret what he calls now his allies in Syria? He's saying that he has friends to work with that are on the ground now. I mean, is that true?
I'm not sure. I mean, he has to decide who are their friends there. But to some extent, it is partially true that Russia hasn't been fully defeated there. However, let's say the bet on Assad, which since day one was there. I engaged myself in several rounds of negotiations indirectly on track 2 and track 1.5 with the Russians, pushing for these political reforms and change of attitude of the regime, at least to be ex-regime now, good to say that, to change that attitude and engage positively in any negotiations. That was not there. Let's not forget that actually the Russian intervention came not only through Syrian official requests, but also came through Iran. So in short, we can say if the Iranians are defeated, then the main ally of Russia in Syria was defeated. And Bashar al-Assad, who has become eventually a kind of a political liability over the Russian policies in the region, yes, has been overthrown. I cannot but say that there was a kind of a communication clearly between Russia and Turkey through the progress that the opposition has surprisingly made, even for its close supporters, if so to speak. But that actually helped in a way to reach the full overthrow of Bashar. President Putin is, in a way, relieved from someone like Bashar al-Assad being in Damascus, but there's a long way to start really talking to the alleged friends for now in Syria.
Okay, let me ask David DeRoche where you see this. And also, please, if you can, comment on what many see as key to Russia's influence, not just in Syria, but in the region, and having its military bases stationed there. I mean, what happens now? Yeah. Is this a success for Russia still?
Well, it'd be a very strange definition of success. Look, there's enough failure to go around. I think that Iran is the big loser here. They loaned more money to Bashar al-Assad, about $30 billion we get back. Russia's loaned about $11 billion. That's gone. Russia had fought some fight against the Islamic State in Palmyra, but for the most part, it stood back. It was actually the American-sponsored coalition that took Raqqa and actually defeated Islamic State. And Russia used the pretext of the Islamic State to crack down on most of the Syrian opposition. So that's a pretext. But at the end of the day, Tartus was the only permanent naval base Russia had in the Mediterranean. They've had a military presence there for about 60 years. That's gone. They are in the process of leaving. The ships are not at port in Tartus because they fear being attacked. We've seen the S-400 radar loaded up and put on Hamena. Hamena is on life support. There might be some sort of a deal where Russia is able to maintain some sort of limited base access. We don't know. Anything's possible. But for now, if it's victory, I think it's a strange victory and tortures the words pretty considerably.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it is confusing, especially for outsiders that don't understand what Sergei is saying. You know, the more detailed, the nuanced, more nuanced version of what actually Russia believes happened, because it's hard to get from what you're describing, David, and potentially losing some incredibly strategic military bases to saying Russia has achieved all of its goals in Syria. And now also, and we have to move forward, David, I need to stick with you on this, because going forward,
Sure.
we will have President Trump coming to office. He's made it clear that Syria is not America's war, but do you think he will have to engage Russia on some level regarding Syria, or can that be completely cut off from the U.S. agenda?
Well, it depends. Right now, if we had to approach Syria right now, Russia is an irrelevancy. You know, the main powers in Syria right now are Turkey, Israel, of course, and Jordan, because they're our partners, and Iraq. Russia is, you know, the concern are basically the two vestigial bases and their future status. And the people who are in power in Damascus right now, they were bombed from those bases. I don't think they're going to want them to continue to exist. So, you know, of course, you know, Russia is a great power. It's a European power. But right now, I think that if we do deal with Russia to solve problems, it will be in Europe and possibly in Africa. Syria, I think events have taken course. The United States basically had this fall in our lap. We didn't make this happen. We didn't influence it. But just the Russian influence is not where it was.
Sergei, I'm going to assume you'll disagree on that final point there, but I also need to ask then you about where you think Russia's relationship is going with the United States, with Trump coming to office. We found it interesting, actually, that President Putin yesterday made such a point of saying that he would specifically talk to Assad about the release of U.S. journalist Austin Tice. I'm not exactly clear on why that is in Russia's interest, unless it is just a way to enter a conversation with President Trump.
As already mentioned, Russia not so much interest to liberate some American journalists and so on, but Russia understood that after military victory with help of Iran and Russia, Bashar al-Assad need to have a political victory. And for this, he should make a liberation of his political regime. You know, very big cruelty on the peak of civil war is not good but understandable. But high cruelty after the peak of civil war, it's stupidity. And Russian advice was to move to the more inclusive government. Inclusive meaning, of course, not LGBT, but to include different political actors in Syria to the new government. And Russia, as a result, giving strong recommendation also to make much more soft behavior of political police of Syrian government. And Bashar al-Assad didn't do it, and it was his mistake. As to Russian interest to have strategic relationship not with Bashar al-Assad, but with Syrian government. If Syrian people decided that that their government should be led by this HTC, okay, Russia will be able to make the deal with them, as Russia making deal with Taliban, who's also quite radical Islamists, but not terrorists. Is the point. Also, if new HTC-led Syrian government will be a little bit more moderate, would be not use terroristic methods, Russia will be able to build a relationship with them. Russia have relations with Syria many decades, and now Russia have negotiation about this. As to military base, Russia, of course, insisting to preserve this because it's used by Russia for different communication on the Mediterranean and African continent. If Syrian government will be independent, it will be agree with Russian military base. If Syrian government will depend will connect it with Turkey. Probably it will be some conditions from Erdogan to Putin, but also Russia will preserve this military base. But if new Syrian government will depend on United States of America and European Union, of course, Russian militaries will have to leave.
Okay. Danny, you know, given the history of the last 14 years and the role Russia played in Syria, I mean, what kind of relationship would any new non-Assad government want with Russia going forward? What would actually serve the people of Syria? We know certain things can be forgiven if it's pragmatic, but how would that work between a new government in Syria and Russia now?
Thank you for that. I mean, I believe now the caretaker government in Damascus have actually sent a positive message toward the Russians, saying we have our hands open to cooperate, to talk, to have this communication going on, and that there would be perhaps good relations with Russia. And I believe also any coming government into Damascus would have an interest to keep good relations with the Russians. However, it would be based on at least to look of what happened through this 14 years and maybe do some amendments, political amendments or political deals. Yes, I do agree that the Russian-Syrian relationship goes really far in history. It would be a pity to see it thrown out from the window just because the Russians have supported one side in Syria rather than the other. What we heard from President Putin is encouraging. I believe Syria in the coming few, at least, years would be adopting a policy of zero problems with the neighbors. Stability is the priority. In order to ensure stability, perhaps good relations with Moscow would be helpful in this regard. So it is, again, in the hands of who would be eventually sitting in Damascus and ruling, but the hope of Syrians themselves that there would be amends with the Russian policies and the consequences of such intervention that happened 10 years ago in favor of Assad rather than the people who are now supported and the Russian policy saying, we are going to have the relationship with Syria. It was the call from the Syrians since day one, have the relationship with Syria, not with Assad.
Okay.
So glad that they are listening to it now.
Yeah, at least there's some conciliatory efforts being made. Let me move on then. David, I'm going to come back to you because there really is a lot to talk about given how long President Putin spoke yesterday on many issues. So one of the things he said that really stood out is how he is ready to compromise on Ukraine even without preconditions. You being a keen observer, I'm wondering what you make of that, because we've heard so much back and forth, especially on this program, of Russian panelists saying, no, Ukraine had their chance, there's no compromise, we're going forward. Now to hear this, 180 degrees, where do you see that?
Well, compromise means a lot of different things. And when you get into the nuts and bolts, the compromise basically means a surrender of Ukraine along Russia's initial war terms. So I think that, Putin wants to see Ukraine basically reduced to a demilitarized rump satrapy with the inability to form alliances with partners that may actually ensure its security, and with most of its industrialized provinces stripped of it and annexed to a country that was pledged to guarantee its territorial integrity. So I think that, what he's saying is aimed primarily at people in the West who are just horrified by the nature of the slaughter. But I don't think anybody in Ukraine is fooled by it. And I don't think, there is a significant body of public opinion that supports Ukraine and its struggle here. So I don't think they're going to view that as anything other than air.
Okay, so Sergei, maybe you can tell us more about what compromise in Putin's mind really does equate to, and also what he meant when he talked about the US and Russia conducting a technological missile duel. I mean, is that kind of an ominous, threatening statement, or just kind of a off-the-cuff sort of comment?
This joke about duel with Americans just was attempt to stress to the Western public that Russia has this Oreshnik system which cannot be stopped by any Western anti-rocket missile system. And because this Oresnik system, rocket system, quite big, Russia doesn't need to use nuclear weaponry for the strong response to the Western countries on Western escalation. So it was Vladimir Putin's message: please do not do not follow the way of escalation, which United States and Joe Biden, who is, from my point of view, a little bit crazy, chosen. And
as for Ukraine,
about compromise,
yeah,
it's about compromise. First of all, you should understand Vladimir Putin very diplomatic and soft and moderate. We can say more clear: Ukraine does not exist as an independent country. It depends not on President of United States. It depends on so-called deep state, and means this combination of the CIA and military intelligence and Pentagon and so on. And they push them forward. So not Ukraine is making decision, but Washington, Langley, and Pentagon are making the decision. But either Trump will be able to establish real control of the deep state, we don't know. Because during the last 4 years in his previous term, Donald Trump was not able to do it. Deep state won in fighting with Donald Trump. And Russia can make compromise about territories. The territory which controlled by Ukrainian government can, which is officially by Russian laws, Russian territory can stay as the Ukraine. But Russia will not make a compromise about character of Ukrainian regime, because we believe that a strongly terroristic regime, this regime killing everybody who want to speak Russian language and who want Russia and Ukraine to be friendly.
Okay.
You know, this regime should be changed. It should be stopping of political repression against Russian language, against Russian Orthodox Church.
Fair enough. Okay, I mean, I guess
laws which prohibited Russian language should we get out.
I guess the point is, I mean, if anyone thought Putin saying that he was ready to compromise on Ukraine, if they thought that was conciliatory, it probably wasn't, because it sounds from Sergei, what you're describing, that we're back to point zero as to where Russia's position stands just by saying simply that Ukraine isn't even an independent country. Anyway, we're down to our last 3 minutes now. Danny, I'll come back to you, because given what has happened, the fact that Russia is still in this war with Ukraine, the fact that they've lost, an ally, potentially military bases in Syria now, still, even if Russia's power has been diminished, that of the US, for example, many would argue has been diminished as well, because now they have a kind of isolationist president taking charge that wants America first and doesn't want any international interventions anyway. So where do you see Russian power on the global stage, especially from a Middle East perspective?
I believe one of the things that might happen with Trump stepping into the White House is actually re-establishing the connections with Russia. Trump hasn't hidden his intention to talk directly to President Putin and try to have at least the communication back on the level, because the communication is there, but on the strategical level that it used to be between Russia and the US. And I believe if that is back, then a lot of problems in the region and the Middle East and worldwide might have an opening, or at least a better conditions. Now, when it comes to Syria in specific and the region in specific, there is the regional countries, these stakeholders around. Everybody is eager to have stability. There has a long time of destabilization, the war in Gaza, the war in Syria, the revolutions, the Arab Spring. Perhaps it is time that this is settled and people talk more about development, about cooperation, about how we can see the future of the Middle East together, knowing that the Iranian influence in the region has been decreased to a major extent. Therefore, it is a chance where I see perhaps the Gulf states and Egypt stepping up with the cooperation, not only with the US or the EU, but also with Russia, in order to have a good Middle East system where the fight for power and balance of power as it used to be. I mean, if you look at it, sometimes it is interesting because it reminds you of the 19th century European kind of map, where any change in the balance of power would push one of the stakeholders to actually try to regain it. Perhaps we can put this aside and push forward for a more stability with a clear-cut role of Turkey in this regard, the Gulf in this regard, and Russia is a definitely potential partner if this is to be put forward.
Okay, that will have to be the final word because so unfortunately we are completely out of time. For this edition of the Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.